Hi, everyone. I hope that you're doing well and you're staying safe. My name is Aimara Rodriguez, and I'm based in New York City. Quick background, I am a first-generation Honduran American working in tech, and I'm super excited to be speaking with all of you today. Currently, I'm the Ecosystem Partnerships Manager for Creative Cloud at Adobe. In my role, I focus on cultivating and unifying the Creative Cloud platform through development of partnerships and different initiatives that help drive adoption of the plugins and integrations that our partners build. I also get to manage the Adobe Fund for Design, which is a $10 million fund started at supporting teams who are building products that will help shape the future of creativity and design. So I'm super excited to be here today with a group of wonderful speakers who I'm sure will have a lot to add and insight to offer. In today's session, we're focused on the importance of designing culturally relevant and inclusive products in today's society. As I'm sure we all have seen over the past few weeks and months and years, there's been a big shift for tech companies and companies at large that are launching or investing in diversity and inclusivity initiatives and or hiring. And in that shift, it's more important than ever that we continue to educate and empower the next generation of Latinx talent on how they can establish a competitive edge when creating products for our community. So today I have three amazing people joining me for a wonderful discussion. We have Cecilia Corral, the VP of Product at CareMessage. We have David Silva, the co-founder of Techqueria. We have Ana Medina, Senior Chaos Engineer at Gremlin. And I'd like to pass it off to each of them to give a deeper introduction on themselves and their backgrounds. So Cecilia, why don't we start with you?
So hi everyone, I'm Cecilia. My family came to the US from Mexico when I was one, so I am from a Mexican background. I'm excited because I know we've got a good diversity of people from Latinx communities here. And I'm the co-founder of VP of Product at CareMessage, where I oversee product management, design, and engineering. And I just like to think that I get to apply a lot of what I learned growing up and my experiences, you know, growing up in a low-income household to what I do at CareMessage. At CareMessage, we focus on patient engagement for underserved communities. So I get to apply a lot of my experiences into healthcare, and excited to chat more about that throughout the conversation.
Awesome. David, how about you?
Hi, so I'm originally from Colombia. I only moved to the US like 7 years ago, and it's always been like super interesting seeing how like the tech community and the startups that I used to work for in Colombia are different to the ones in Silicon Valley and even in New York. As Aimara said, I'm the co-founder of Techqueria, but my day job is a software engineer. So I'm currently working for a company called Tijiko.com. We're building a marketplace for educators and workshops and learners to be able to offer their products to reach a bigger audience. And I've worked actually before that. I used to work in healthcare. I worked for companies like Doctor on Demand and stuff like that. I think like it is very interesting, or I'm very passionate about tech because it is possible to create solutions that affect a lot of people in a positive way. And I'm looking forward to continue working in other products like that can continue helping people.
Awesome. Anna, how about you?
I love being part of this panel already. Just hearing introductions of the folks that I'm with. It's always really inspiring. As it's mentioned, I'm a senior chaos engineer at Gremlin. The company focuses on building a more reliable internet. We do that by pioneering a space called chaos engineering, is where you actually break your systems, your applications, your products in order to make them more reliable. So we have a SaaS offering that allows companies to lower the cost of downtime and really prepare their engineers for when chaos kind of happens in their systems. Prior to being at Gremlin, I worked at Uber for 2 years, where I did a lot of the same chaos engineering work, did a lot of that diversity and inclusion work there. And I've also gotten a chance to work at a really small startup based out of Miami, a credit union, and did a lot of like freelance projects. And I was born and raised in Costa Rica. My parents are Nicaraguan, so double like Central American love. I've been living in the United States since I was like 13. So still consider like Costa Rica as like my home, but I do know that I've been in the United States for enough time to also understand that life out here is very, very different than what I grew up in. And that is hard to deal with, but it also lets me bring all those insights into how do we build inclusive communities? How do we build those products that really touch upon the global market and not just the white males that are building the products when the companies are based out of the United States and specifically Silicon Valley. So I'm super, super eager to be on this panel. On the side, I advocate a lot for getting more like Latinos, like specifically Latinas, into technology and careers in STEM, as well as I'm a huge advocate for mental health and making sure that we're breaking that stigma and having those conversations and being there for one another.
Awesome. Wow. I feel like you guys just gave me all the energy I need for a Friday afternoon. And I'm super excited to hear more about that. So to kick things off, I'd be interested to have each of you kind of do a deeper dive on your background and the road to you entering tech. And if you had to kind of summarize one aspect of that, what would you say being a Latinx in tech has taught you when it comes to kind of building career and identifying your own self-worth?
I'm happy to kick it off. I am untraditional, unique, and amazing. I come from a very untraditional path. I taught myself how to code at 13 years old as like we were getting settled in the United States. I realized that I can make money off of it. So I started freelancing when I was like in middle school, high school. I come from a low income home. So this was my way of helping my parents as we were going through some financial difficulties. But then I really realized that I was passionate about it. So in high school, I got internships and it made me realize I wanted to go to a college and study computer science. Sadly, I realized college wasn't for me and I ended up dropping out, but I still continued pursuing technology. And I got a chance to work at Google, go back to the credit union that I had been part of. And I ended up landing at Uber and then transitioning over to Gremlin. So part of that like really untraditional path of being a college dropout really makes me say like, no matter where you come from is really much about the self-discipline that you put in to learn. And through my different Silicon Valley stories, a lot of what I learned, it's like, I'm unique. I bring a lot to the table. There's not many Latinas that are engineers that are being there and making those decisions, advocating for our people when companies and products are being made. And I think with that, it's like, I get to really advocate for having myself on the conversations where decisions are getting made, but it's also part of like my job as a minority to make sure that I'm opening the doors for the next minority to have it a lot easier than I did.
So true. I feel like insert clap hands emojis here. Like I agree with all of that. Cecilia, how about you?
I think I followed a more traditional path in some ways. I grew up in a low-income household, and I think I was just very fortunate that I had a lot of really great mentors and teachers and people that like put me on a path from a young age. When I was in high school, I found out about this like early college program that was being offered at a local community college. And so I started taking engineering college courses when I was in high school. And that I think was then like put me on this whole other path. And I think that's probably the only reason I got into Stanford. But once I got to Stanford, it was just the biggest culture shock of my life. I had never been around, I grew up in the border with Mexico. So my community was like 99% Mexican and Mexican American. And so going to Stanford was like the biggest culture shock of my life. I had never been around that kind of affluence and people of so many different backgrounds. And, I just felt like there was so much privilege in that space and a lot that like I just felt like this sort of need to do something good with it. Like it's just like all these doors that are open for me, I need to do something with it. And so initially I thought that it was going to be at Stanford I studied product design engineering, so that was kind of how I kept down the engineering path. But, I knew from even when I was in high school that there was this gap of, women and people of color in tech and in engineering. And that was the only reason why that program I was a part of in high school was even created. And then when I got to Stanford, I kept seeing it. And I kept seeing it because I had applied to internships and nobody would even give me an interview. But, there were like 4 or 5 guys named Matt in my program that all got hired at Apple. Like, it was just like, very, very obvious. And so I just never felt like I was going to be able to follow a traditional path into actually using my education for something. And initially I thought I was going to go into engineering education. So I ended up going to grad school, and then my dad, who'd been diagnosed with prostate cancer for years before that, passed away. And so it just made me kind of reevaluate things. And the fact that I always felt like tech wasn't necessarily going to let me in. I felt like I had to like kind of create my own door in. And so I ended up joining my co-founder and kind of starting Care Message from there, focused on healthcare, because I just felt sort of this connection to a lot of the challenges my family had faced. And I feel like there's, you know, we can definitely talk about it, but I feel like there's a lot of opportunities for Latinos to just create their own doors, because I think a lot of what we see in tech, you know, there's just people that are actively don't want us there, and that's
Right.
okay, right? I feel like, you know, this whole conversation is going to be about the opportunities that we are able to identify as Latinos that like other people completely overlook, because they're, you know, they're not looking in the right place. And so as challenging as it's been, you know, but at the same time, like, okay, well, now I get to go raise money from the companies that ignored my resume for the longest time. So
There you
know,
go.
I made my way in, just a different path.
Yeah. And before we get to David, I think one interesting thing that you called out is this concept of traditional path versus non-traditional. And I think what people tend to forget is when you are a minority breaking into tech, traditional doesn't really mean the same thing it does to other people, because usually you're the first person doing that thing in your family. So in a way, you're setting that traditional path, and it can be difficult to maneuver that when you're trying to figure it out along the way. And I think that that's an interesting point that we could touch on a little bit later. But David, I'd love to hear from your perspective too.
Oh my God, I'm so inspired by you. I feel like I you know, describing your past is so complicated because I had a lot of erratic decisions, and it, you know, none of them make sense. And so a lot of people think that, like, you know, we have life that like are linear, but I was like all over the place. And so I guess, you know, from the beginning, I grew up in Cali, Colombia, which was the most dangerous city on the planet at the time, because it was like governed by the narcos. And I grew up right when Pablo Escobar was killed. So if you've seen like Narcos season 3, you know my childhood. And it was like, I mean, so there are things that, like, you know, they affect you a lot, right? Like I was like 9 years old the first time I got mugged. Like I was like maybe like 8 the first time I saw somebody being shot in front of you, and that you become kind of like very hardened to like reality. And then there's a lot of like a very long process of unlearning a lot of those things. And you know, especially growing up in Colombia, I guess, you know, like people in the US are a lot more like, you know, woke, but in Colombia we're still like super behind in a lot of topics. So there's a lot of like, you know, attitudes that you grow up with that, you know, nobody tells you really to challenge them, especially when you grow up kind of like poor, because you're, you know, you're so worried about like, what are we gonna eat? What are we gonna do? Can we really afford this high school or not? And yeah, so like I grew up with like a family, like my parents were always kind of like struggling because they wanted like more for me and my brother. But you know, they never really kind of like made it. So it was like a lot of like, oh, this year we're going to a better high school. Next year we're going to a shitty high school. Sorry, like a more low income high school. I don't know. Sorry, words. And there was a lot of like that growing up, and a lot of like, I don't know who I am. Where do I belong? Where do I not belong? And whatever. Then I ended up graduating high school when I was like 16. And what I really wanted to do and be was an artist. So I signed up for this art school. I couldn't like afford finishing the program, so I ended up dropping out when I was like 18. And the only thing that I could do back then that I could afford was going to a Jewish seminary, because if you're Jewish, it's like free, and you can just like be like, hey, I want to go to seminary, and somebody pays for all your shit. So so I went to like Miami for a while, and then I moved to Israel, and I spent like 3 years like trying to become a rabbi. And then I moved back to Colombia. And at the same time that I moved back to Colombia, like my rabbi got fired. So I like took over a few of his things that I was supposed to be doing at the synagogue. And then I was like, well, I hate this life. I don't want to do it again. And then I was like 22, and I'm like, what can I do with my life? And the only thing that I could think of is like, oh, I used to do websites when I was in high school. Maybe I can start doing websites for work. And a friend gave me a job at his company doing like websites for clients. And that's how I got into tech, I guess. After a few years of that, I was like, well, I really, really hate it here. Colombia is like a very classist country, and it's like a very complicated place to live in. And the tech industry in Colombia was heavily dominated by like the people from, or still probably heavily dominated by the people that went to like the rich people schools, or the people that like had the opportunity to spend some time in Silicon Valley or in the US. So I never really like it was fun that it was a very like a small community, and that it was very easy to participate, but it was also not so fun that like it felt like it was very classist, right? Like all the government initiatives were meant for people that had money. All the government initiatives were meant for people that knew how to read these documents and had the time to prepare a 400-page proposal, whatever. And I, you know, I kept hearing that Silicon Valley was great. So I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna move to Silicon Valley. Maybe if I live there for a while, I can like go back to Colombia and shine. And so like I don't know, like I won a contest and I managed to like get a flight to Silicon Valley. It was hard. It was crazy. Like it's not very easy to try and get a job when you don't have like a work permit, or you're not very good speaking English and things like that. So and one of the things that I learned very early is that companies don't care about hiring Latinos if you charge very little. And companies don't care about charging undocumented people if you charge very little. So my first jobs in Silicon Valley, I was extremely underpaid, like extremely underpaid. And there was a bunch of, like, I met a lot of other people like me. They were like we, you know, we didn't know better. Nobody had told us about like know your worth or salary negotiation and stuff like that. So it was, you know, it was kind of tough, but it was also like very, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm still here and I'm happy and things worked out at the end. But there was many times that, you know, there was many times that it was very easy to like, you know, want to give up. And there was many people that I met that were like me, coming from all different countries, that couldn't make it. And not only Latinos, also like, you know, people come to Silicon Valley from all over the world, Germany, Australia, France, whatever, all looking for opportunities. And a lot of people don't make it. So I don't know. In a way, it's hard because you hear all these stories of Mark Zuckerberg, and then you think like, oh, if Mark Zuckerberg did it, I can do it too. And it's like, and then when you read more into it, it's like, okay, no, it's actually not true. But you know, what's it called, like selection bias. And at the end of the day, it's like, I don't know, it's a very tough industry, and it's been a very interesting journey. But we're still fighting. I'm far from being like rich, or I still need to work and whatnot. But you know, we're happy. Like live in Jersey City now. I'm working for my boss is this Colombian woman that I love. So it's you know, it's very chill. It's very nice season right now. And then sorry, and we started Techqueria like 5 years ago, I think, like yeah, in December 2015, with a friend from my co-working space, because we're like the only two Latinos in the co-working space, and we're wondering like, hey, like we know that the numbers are very low, but it is like, it feels like it's impossible that I'm like, you're the only other Latino in tech that I know. And we figure maybe if we start a meetup, then people will come to us, and then we can make more friends. And if we make more friends, we can support each other better. And Techqueria now is one of the largest, you know, like organizations that serve Latino people in tech. And we're very fortunate. I'm very grateful to like all the people that have helped, you know, make it this far, all the members, volunteers, executive directors, board members, advisor boards, and our friends. So yeah, I think, I don't know, I guess all that rant is to say that, like, I mean, things are hard, so don't feel like super discouraged if things are hard for you, but also things are possible if you know, find a community, find a group of people that support you. And the more you give to, I feel like the more you receive in a way, but not like in a cliche way, but like in a very actual way. People, especially in our community, people tend to be very, very grateful. So the more you like give and contribute to others, the more that will like reflect better for you in the future.
100%. And I think as we dive into some of the more specific questions, I think the underlying layer for how other Latinx talent can thrive in today's environment is finding a community, finding people that they can relate with, that you don't have to over-explain things. And I mean, I think we're a great example. I've met David before, but I haven't met you other two ladies. And I feel like I can talk to you about anything. And that just goes to show that you can find pockets of people who are willing to support you on your journey into breaking into tech and working your way up. So I'd be curious to hear from each of you, in your perspective, what do you think is kind of the most critical piece when designing products today and services, and what's affected if we don't continuously think about diversity and inclusivity? And what do you feel is the first step in making these experiences inclusive for designers and developers?
I can jump in. I think within this year specifically, with COVID in healthcare, it's just critical that we're thinking about communities of color. I mean, the infection rates, the death rates amongst our communities are, you know, much higher, disproportionately higher than white communities. And so it's important, I think, for healthcare from an equity perspective to have that lens of like, what is the negative impact that your product might have, unintended consequences that are just based on historical systemic inequities, because a lot of what we're seeing today, it's not new. I mean, the fact that Latinx and Black and African American communities and Native American communities die at a higher rate is not because of anything that happened this year. It's because of historical systemic inequities. And I think when you're designing a product, and for us, you know, we kind of saw that before it happened, and it was sort of like, let's just brace ourselves, because we know the history of healthcare, and we know what like this is going to look like when a doctor has one ventilator and has two perfectly similar people, but one is white, one is Black. Like, who are they going to put their resources into, knowing what we know historically about how decisions have been made in this country? So I think carrying that and bringing that forward to ensure that you're not creating products that you're essentially creating products to be anti-racist, or you're creating products like to essentially like fight against these inequities, because it's easy enough to, and I go on these rants all the time, but like people are like, oh, AI in healthcare. And I'm just like, well, what data did you feed this? Like, where did that come from? And if you're taking just like what you have from historical data, you're just going to perpetuate, not just perpetuate, scale inequities. And I think that's the biggest, you know, potential negative effect of when you're building technology and you're not taking these things into consideration. Like, you run the risk of scaling inequity at a scale that we've never seen before, where like, yes, there might be one biased doctor that's making these decisions, and there's obviously like negative impact to individuals. But when you're feeding that into an algorithm that's now like making decisions for millions of people, it's like inequity at a scale that just could be completely detrimental to our society. But I think it's important for people like us to be in the room making these decisions, pushing people to think about these decisions and challenging people's assumptions as much as possible. Because I know everyone's kind of on their own journey, and I'm on my own journey. I've been reading a lot of things and learning a lot, and trying as much as I can to learn about, you know, some of our communities and people that have even less privilege. Our Native American community is one that like is just insane, the amount of things that have happened and have been perpetuated to them historically in this country. And those things, again, if we're not actively teaching ourselves, even as people that come from minority populations, like we also have to learn, and we have to ensure that we're looking out for the others that have less privilege than us, so that as much as we're showing up and fighting for our communities, we're also not, you know, missing the lens of, you know, someone that might be Afro-Latinx, or somebody that might be Native American, or somebody that might, you know, come from some other intersection that even if we don't identify with it ourselves, like if we get our foot in the door, we kind of have a responsibility to also speak up for others and ensure that, you know, if we're there to help make a decision on a product and the way it's being designed, especially if you get to do it at the very beginning, that we're planting those seeds so that hopefully, you know, we're fighting these inequities, and that stays with whatever we're building after, you know, we're no longer building it ourselves. But yeah, educating and sharing that knowledge, and just, you know, raising our voice as much as we can, I think is really important.
That's so true. I think one of the many awesome things that you said, one that stuck out to me was, you know, as companies scale, which people tend to attribute as a positive thing, it also runs the risk of scaling inequity at a rate that we've never seen it before, unless we're addressing it at the root. And I think that this is why it's more important than ever for companies to understand that at the core, this is why hiring and investing in hiring, not just capital, but techniques. How are you really kind of raising the next generation of hiring managers to identify biases from the start as soon as a person sits down to introduce himself and hands you their resume? And I think that, you know, that's a point that's not being talked about enough, or is being approached in a way that's very fragmented and not a part of the bigger picture. So Anna, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I see you nodding your head, and I feel like you'd have a lot to offer.
I have a lot to say, but like I will say Cecilia like nailed it right on the head with some of my talking points. It's very much of more Latinos need to be in the conversations as these product decisions are getting made. So as the diagrams of like the ideas are coming out, we need to have a say in what is being created, because there are products out there that are going to be targeted towards people that look like me, people that are Black, Indigenous. And if with the people that were creating it weren't thinking about them, they're not going to work for them. We see how people who try washing their hands, sometimes it doesn't detect their skin color. We see over and over that social media continues pushing images of white people over any other color. And it's like, these are the algorithms that are making those decisions. So like Cecilia's saying is like, the people creating the algorithms need to keep that in mind. And what better way, if we are the ones that create it, we build a future that we want for like us Latinos, the Black community, the Indigenous communities, and the disabled community. Like, we're not, like, race is not the only minority that we have to keep in mind. And like, there's so many layers of that to unpack. But I would say that it really does come to you, if you don't have diversity as like one of the core functionalities of any product decision that your organization does, you're going to stumble. You actually might end up failing. So why don't you actually start implementing it as one of the first phases of getting the right people, diverse talent into your organization to actually start collectively thinking about it prior to doing the engineering work, prior to going to the marketing team and being like, we're going to launch this. Like, we need to be part of those conversations as early as possible. And with that, it comes very much of like people like us continuing to speak out about it. I mean, I know David for so many years through like social media, and we finally got to meet like 3 or 4 years ago. But it was one of those things of like, I feel like I know you because we've been through so much together, and we're now in 2020. 2020 has been such an insane year, and it's not even over yet, super sad face, but it's one of those that like people in America are finally waking up and realizing discrimination around race is a thing. How many years have we been saying this? How many years have we been asking for tech companies to be held accountable for the deaths that happen due to their algorithms, the discrimination that happens? So it really, really just goes back to that. Like, we need to be at those tables. We need to be part of those conversations. Companies need to have more people that are diverse just at their company, and in leadership levels more than ever. Those are the positions in an organization that can actually create change. They have the budget, they're able to hire, they're able to push back on advisors and the venture capitalists at your organization. So it all like really lays back to the people at the top. If they don't keep diversity in mind, we're in really, really bad shape. And a lot of that is kind of where we're at right now. We see a lot of the companies that are trying to firefight. They're trying to say like, no, my product wasn't racist, or no, I did not say that, or there's no way this entire social media platform could have actually made the election a lot worse. Like, every company is like, nope, that wasn't my responsibility. And it's like, no, it was your responsibility. You wrote the code for it. Your code influenced an entire world. You need to own up to it. And it goes into like those ethics conversations that it's like an entire other conversation for another panel. But it's like the communities that we belong to, especially those that are not born into the United States, they don't come from American families, any immigrant, we grew up with very different mentalities, and we think about different things. Our good and bad is very, very different. American societies sometimes are a little bit more lenient, while we're like, no, we need to have empathy. We all need to give love. We all need to give community. So it's like all those things kind of get misplaced when we're not part of those conversations, which lead to the tremendous trash fires that we continue these tech companies going through. And I think you kind of touched upon hiring, and hiring is that other one. It's like my personal stance is that I'm not a fan of referral networks, because referral networks usually have a bias towards the people that were already at the company. So if a company is created from people from only Ivy Leagues, your 30 employees, your first 30 employees actually might only be Ivy Leagues. But guess what? You missed out on all the people that are self-taught, all the people that didn't have money to go to college, or had a mental health condition that didn't allow for them to finish their degree, because you only stuck to your bubble and you didn't think outside the box to bring more diverse people. You're stuck. Your product might not launch. Your company might not be able to get that IPO and reach the global market that your investors want you to. So a lot of it is like, get more diverse talent, make that diverse talent, like give them development paths for them to get into leadership, for them to become vice presidents, for them to start joining boards, and for us to continuing having conferences like this to talk about our experiences, but lift each other up.
Hell yeah. That's all I could say to that. I feel like I need popcorn just hearing you guys talk. But I think that I've been thinking a lot about is not just our Latinx community and the Black community and Indigenous communities speaking up and advocating for ourselves, but honestly, individuals who are white, who are in decision-making, roles, being able to take a step back and willing to relinquish power. That's really how we get to this equitable stage that we all really need to be in, and we've needed to be in for many, many years. That's a separate conversation. But I think when we think about true diversity and inclusivity, it's not just advocating for the sake of advocating, it's advocating for the sake of change. And that change has to involve people willing to step aside and finally give people like us and many others who don't look like us a chance to start kind of making decisions on how things look like. So David, I'd love to hear from your perspective around just designing and what are things to keep in mind in today's age.
I love everything you're saying. This is like so inspiring. It's making me like reconsider what I had in mind to answer. But I just wanted to add another thing, I guess. So I read a book recently called Abolish Silicon Valley. It just came out. It was I think it's a very good book about this woman from Canada. She tried to make it in Silicon Valley, and how she processed like a lot of the things that happened to her, and her final conclusion. And I mean, you don't have to agree or not with the book, but I think it's very important to read other people's conclusions. And her final conclusion is that Silicon Valley cannot be safe because the motive of the profit is always going to get on the way of everything else, right? And so, like, I think there's, I mean, I've been doing a lot of like this work of like, how do we get more Latino people into tech companies? And for the longest time, we were kind of like focusing on like entry-level people, like how do we get these bootcamp people, like jobs in tech, whatever, to help with social mobility. But what we have, seen is that will never move the needle. Like if we hire 25,000 new grads that are Latino into Google, they're, at the same rate, Google is gonna hire, sorry, not Google, like anybody is gonna hire a bunch of other white people. So it's never gonna move the needle if we keep focusing on that. And I really, really like what Anna was saying, like we need to focus a lot more in leadership, boards, founders, VCs, and things like that. But at the same time, I feel a little conflicted because a lot of the time, and I have seen this experience with Latino and Black people that I've met in the past, sometimes our people get into these positions and they become much more comfortable with the white people around them than they were with the Latinos that came before. And then it's even worse. I don't know, like I'm Jewish, and we have this like there's the things that happen on the Holocaust about like the Sonderkommandos, which were like the Jewish people that would volunteer to like burn other Jewish people to get a little more bread. And unfortunately, we still see a lot of that in our communities, and it makes me, I don't know, see the numbers of like Latino people that are voting for Trump and stuff like that. And hopefully there's not a lot of Trump supporters looking at this panel, but it's kind of like disheartening sometimes to see like, how participating on a corrupt system tends to corrupt us more than we can fix it. And so I'm still like very like conflicted by that, and I don't have an answer, just anguish. But the other thing that I wanted to mention too is that you know, inclusivity or diversity mostly come from two different angles, right? Like there's a group of people that believe that inclusivity is the right thing to do, and that it's a moral imperative to aim for inclusivity and diversity. But there's other people that believe that inclusivity is very important for business, right? So like, oh, if you want to like grow your company over, like Facebook had a whole thing about like, if we want our company to grow over 1 billion users, we need to start focusing on like India and South America and whatnot. And then Facebook had like this very aggressive campaign to force governments in South America and India to give you know, free Facebook access to people on those countries. And in a way, right, like on face value, you see that and you're like, oh my God, Facebook is so inclusive. They're giving like free Facebook to like people in India. But when you actually think about it, it's like, whoa, this is extremely, extremely harmful and extremely bad. So I don't know, many times I think like I'm very happy that these companies are so incompetent and so arrogant, because it will be a lot worse if they got away with it. And yeah, and I don't know, like I really think that we need to start creating our own products and our own things. I don't want Twitter to become, so I don't want a lot of these tech companies to become more prevalent in our communities. I want our products to be more prevalent in our communities, but also like the right way, I guess. I don't know, like a lot of Latino people that end up becoming founders is because they were very rich from the start. They all went from Stanford. Like they never kind of like experienced a lot of the things that we experienced. So I think, I don't know, I think it makes a very big difference. Our communities are extremely varied and very different. There's like millions of Latino people in the US. Assuming that they're all woke and care about disabilities or mental health or whatever is a mistake. And I think that's also very important for anybody that's trying to do inclusive product design, to realize that you cannot treat a community like ours as a monolith. You have to be very open to like understand the different types of like Latino communities and sub-communities and like, you know, immigrant versus American and stuff like that. And like design with that in mind. Sorry.
Absolutely.
Randy.
No, don't apologize. There are a couple of things you said that I want to quickly highlight and then kind of move on to the next topic. But I think one, when we think about the topic of how fellow Latinx in tech can stay authentic to themselves, I can only speak for myself, but sometimes it can be tiring to code switch. When I'm constantly thinking about how I am staying authentic to myself and really thinking about adding the right type of feedback and information to product discussions, marketing discussions, but then trying to make sure I deliver that in a way that appeases everyone. And I think that's a layer that a lot of people don't talk about. And that can be harmful to people, especially if you don't work with anyone or interact with people that look like you, because then you're just kind of internalizing that. So definitely something to call out when you are creating the path, usually the path that hasn't been paid for in your friend group and your community group. It can be lonely and isolating, but don't ever let yourself feel small. I think that that's really important for people to remember. Secondly, you're right. I think that people automatically assume there's a Latino or Latina in a leadership position and then we've all made it. But the reality is there's a lot of nuance and intersectionality to privilege. And if we continue to only focus on promoting men and women of color to leadership positions in pre-existing companies and not giving them the path to create their own products, their own companies, and fund their own innovation, I think we're only solving half of the puzzle. So I appreciate all of your perspectives on that. I think that that's really helpful. I'd be curious to hear about your general approach to design and development, and what are some of the questions that you tend to ask yourself or bring up during that process? And what do you think are other things that Latinx and tech designers and developers should be thinking about or bringing up when they're in the room?
I can take that. Oh, I was gonna say I could take the first pass at like two or three things that kind of come to mind. Who is the target market for the stuff that we're building? Most companies are probably building a global product. So you want to take into consideration what that global market is, like that intersections that we're talking about. We're bringing in so many different races. We're bringing so many different languages. We're bringing so many different traditions. How does our product actually relate to that? Secondly, how can my product be used for harm? What abuse can happen in the platform products that I'm creating that I'm not thinking about? It could be as simple as how social media platforms can be used for harassment. And if you don't have the right tools built into your product in order to report that harassment and get those bad actors off your platform, you're going to be in a lot of trouble down the line. And with those, like, it comes into also like the type of contracts that this products can go into. We're at like LTX Fest, so I can talk about like the ICE contracts, like making sure that you have those conversations early on with your leadership of like, give me the list of all the organizations that we're publicly saying we're not doing business with. Like, let's make sure that we put it out there and we're advocating for like, no, you want to reach the Latinx community? Well, go stand by the Latinx community and don't let ICE use our platform to continue deporting us. And third is reliability. So I'm a reliability engineer, so this is like a different type of topic for me. But when we look at the companies, we see all these tech companies have two things in common. They're struggling with their services going down because they didn't think about reliability. Secondly, they're in the media because diversity and inclusion, equity was not part of the leadership plan. And those are things that you could have had those conversations as early as you're building your companies and products. And with reliability, when we go back to that first point of global market and the audience that we're trying to reach, have you thought about the users that you're trying to reach from Brazil, Colombia, Peru? What is their internet connection like? What is the latency when they're trying to connect to the data centers that you're hosting in California? Because that's where your Silicon Valley company is based out of. What about the students that are in Australia that don't have access to computers? What about like all those other markets? So you want to think about your engineering problems also with diversity, inclusion, and reliability in mind. How is it that we can make sure that they're always getting an experience that is customer focused, that is very resilient, that if the website application fails, there's got to be a fallback plan. If not, your customers are going to leave your platform. And with that, like, we don't really see those tech companies kind of like having those conversations. So it really goes back to David's point of like, we really need to, one, create our companies, be the leadership in our companies, but then also continue having more minority investors to make sure that we just continue being part of the whole full conversation.
That's so true. And I think, you know, what's interesting, and I can't, you know, make a blanket statement, but I think a lot of designers and developers tend to think about making products inclusive from a localization perspective. So as long as individuals who speak other language can, you know, read what a certain, you know, marketing campaign or a product description looks like, then we're checking the box. But I think the other aspect of it, to your point, is reliability, and also what is the circumstance? Do they have access to the same sort of circumstance that a person in New York City or Silicon Valley does when interacting with your product? And most people don't even think about that because it's not baked into the process in which you test a product before it goes to market. And that's the overarching issue here. What type of questions and things are we looking at before we bring something to market? So Cecilia, I'd love to hear, you know, your take on that and anything you'd recommend for people to think about when they're in the room.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, and you know, when I hear it from other companies, I think people see this need for inclusive design as like another thing we have to do, or they see it as like, oh, why are we being forced to think about this? But the way I see it, it's like, it actually makes your product for your entire population better. When you're thinking through these scenarios. So we work in healthcare, we work with low-income people. A lot of people in this country don't have a smartphone. And so for us, the majority of the communication we power is text messaging. And that doesn't mean that somebody with a smartphone cannot access our technology. It just means like everybody can actually access our technology because it's a text message and it can reach any mobile device. You don't need to have a smartphone. You don't need to download an app to be able to get healthcare information from your provider or interact with your healthcare provider. It doesn't take anything away from the people that have a smartphone, or people, even you could use our product for somebody that's maybe more affluent. That's not who it's designed for, but I'm sure it worked just the same. And then when you're thinking about, you know, we're talking earlier about how we're we're the Latinx community, but there's a lot of diversity within the community as well. And it's important to think about all those dimensions. We serve a lot of like millions of Latinx patients nationally. And I'm constantly thinking about, in the same way, like what is the common denominator? What's the easiest way or the most inclusive way we can communicate information? With COVID, we were seeing a lot of our clinics send out information to try and address social determinants of health. And food insecurity was probably the #1 thing that was affecting all of our patients, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, whatever. But when you're providing those resources, just as an example, if your first thing you're providing to your patient population is something tied to SNAP or, you know, food stamps, that's not including your undocumented patients that don't get to qualify for food stamps, right? And so why not instead send the first resource as a food bank, as something that's not going to ask you for your legal status? You know, it's free, and it doesn't, again, take away anything from somebody that might be a US citizen, but it is bringing in, you know, and reaching the broadest set of your patient population. And I've seen it also just not work well. You were referencing that sometimes people think like, well, I'm just going to get this information and translate it into Spanish and like check the box, like, oh, we reached the Latinx community. And we were actually in a deal with with a clinic, a pretty large clinic that serves predominantly Hispanic patients. And I took a look at some of the content recommendations that our competitor was making. One of the messages was like, oh, you know, during this COVID time, maybe you can learn a new language. And I sat there and I looked at that message and I was like thinking like, okay, you realize this healthcare organization serves predominantly Hispanic, Latinx community, predominantly Spanish speaking, and you're going to send them a message that says, maybe you should learn a new language. How is that any different than if my mom is at the grocery store on the phone talking in Spanish and someone telling her, you're in America, speak English, right? Like, there are real implications for somebody not thinking through. Again, if you take that and you just translate it into Spanish and you think I'm going to check the box and that's okay, that is just like not enough in terms of designing, you know, in an inclusive way, because you have to think about the different dimensions of how your end users are going to perceive what you're designing. And those are a lot of the things that, at least for me, I try to challenge myself and challenge my team to think through. You know, we're not treating a monolithic group. There's a lot of diversity here, and how do we ensure that especially the most marginalized people within this population are not left out and they feel like they can relate with what they're receiving from their healthcare organizations. And we end up having to educate our own clinics a lot of times about these things, because some of these things make them uncomfortable, but I kind of feel like it's our job to make them a little uncomfortable sometimes when they're a little afraid to touch upon certain topics. But, you know, at the end of the day, at least for us in healthcare, it's pretty critical for us to meet our goal to just make people a little bit uncomfortable so that we can get to the end goal of actually helping the patients.
That's so true. And I've personally never worked in healthcare before, but I think that example you just painted it really hit home with me. I think people don't think long enough about small messaging like that, commercials, emails that you're getting, pamphlets that you're reading, things you're digesting, and how, depending on who you're speaking to, the context is totally different and can do more harm than good. So David, I'd love to hear your take on, you know, what both Anna and Cecilia have mentioned, and how do you think that, you know, people can start asking different questions when they're in the room?
I want to say that I feel like I don't have a lot to add and that my answer is going to suck now, but my most of my experience is with very, very, very small companies. And when you're working at a very, very small company, like I'm basically the only developer in my company right now. So you also have to kind of like you have to remember that it is impossible to actually include everybody, especially when you're, you know, only one engineer, right? So when I'm like dividing my engineering time, I'm thinking like, okay, I need to write tests to make sure that the code is reliable. I need to make sure to add alt tags to all the images to make sure that like screen readers can read this. Through like I'm trying to add translations to make sure that like, you know, people that don't speak English can read the text. But all of these things take engineering resources, right? And I guess yeah, I'm agreeing with like Cecilia a lot. It's like you just have to make sure that like you take all of this into account when you're making like, you know, you're picking what am I gonna like spend more time on or whatnot, right? Like I'm at a very early stage company, so like my test coverage is very tiny, well, compared to what hopefully should be, right? Like I barely have JSN because, you know, time, but so I think like, you know, like having into account your users kind of like falls into this bucket too, right? Like you're always making trade-offs, and you're like okay, my product might not work very good with people that are hard of hearing, or my product might not work very well with this or that, but at least I guess, you know, remembering that and being aware of it will like put it on your backlog. Like do not forget about it, because I've spoken to many early stage founders and previously in my career too, and they're very dismissive of these topics, and it's like, okay, don't dismiss it. Just because you can do it right now doesn't mean that you have to forget about it forever. So, you know, throw it on the backlog, in the same backlog where you throw like your cool feature ideas and your test coverage goals and chaos engineering, like put it there, but don't forget about it. And yeah, no, I guess just wanted to add that you know, don't beat yourself too hard at the beginning too, because being a founder can be really hard, and creating a product can be really hard. And this is just one thing, you know, it's another thing that you have to remember, but it's not, I don't know, you know, sometimes it can break your company, right? Like what's it called? It's called early optimizing. I forgot the word that we use, but like, you know, if you optimize too early for inclusion and diversity, then your company is not going to make it to the next funding round, and then your company is not going to exist. So make sure that you're balancing out this with everything else.
Totally. A concept that I think a lot about is this term. I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but organizational debt. And that's been being thrown around a lot when it comes to the topic of diversity and inclusivity, because to David's point, if you only think about that too early on, you're not optimizing for scale or growth. But if you don't think about that, it can impact your ability to scale and to grow. And the concept of organizational debt is knowing all of these decisions that you should be making and things that you should be thinking about, but you don't prioritize them until it comes to really harm you or your ability to grow and scale in the future. And I think
like
a lot of yeah, I think a lot of the conversation right now is how do you find the balance and know what to focus on depending on where your company is at or where you're at in your career. And I think just doing a quick time check, one of the topics that I'd love to hear each of you kind of speak about is, you know, right now you're seeing more tech companies, more than ever, you know, launch new initiatives, new funds, new programs, you name it, any and all things related to diversity and inclusivity. But you still fundamentally hear a lot of companies and leaders say that inclusive design or, you know, hiring with diversity in mind is either too expensive or it's a nice to have, but unless it's core to the business objective, should be something that they revisit. And honestly, we all know that that's not the case. It goes hand in hand with, you know, accomplishing business objectives. What would you say are some things that companies can practically do right now to embrace the inclusive design and inclusivity in terms of hiring when it comes to product and service?
I can try. This is so hard. Sorry, companies suck at this. It's crazy. A lot of companies have these like huge, like, what do you call it? I don't know, like, you know, companies have these like Black Lives Matter logos and t-shirts, and they send like 500 of their employees to the Pride Parade in San Francisco, 500 straight employees to the Pride Parade in San Francisco. And it's like your t-shirts are cute, but they're not fucking doing shit. So it's like, if you're like, I mean, personally, I guess when a company is talking to us about like partnering with our organization or whatever, I tell them that the bare minimum that you can do is give me a special link that if somebody on my organization, you know, some of our members use that link, they at least get a phone call. Like you can't be like giving us money or making cute t-shirts and shit like that if you're not gonna at least give our members a phone call, right? Like, I mean, we all, I mean, maybe a lot, like all of we know, but like a lot of like companies use this like automated resume reading thingy. So most of the time when you apply to a big tech company, no human is even looking at your resume, and your resume might be getting discarded just because whatever, you didn't go to Stanford, or you put a picture on it, or your resume was 2 pages. Like there's a lot of like unsaid rules on the tech industry that are not very clear, particularly, you know, since the prevalence of AI on these things. So if you don't have somebody to guide you and tell you these things, you're gonna get rejected a lot of the time, and you're not even gonna get, you know, a lot of these companies, they reject you and they don't even tell you why. So I tell people, like, you know, I tell the people that I'm trying, like, you know, we're partnering with, is like, my most important thing, like my biggest condition is like, at least, you know, give these people a phone call. Don't discard people on their resume. A lot of people don't know how to write resumes. That's a skill that is totally unrelated to how good of an engineer you are or how good of a designer you are. So it's like, if you don't change the way that you're hiring people, then the money that you're giving us is just bullshit and fluff to like whitewash your actions. And that's very hard. It's very hard. A lot of the time we get a lot of pushback because companies are like, you know, people don't want to admit that they are in the wrong. They want to think that like, oh my God, but we're not like racist. We like tweeted about Black Lives Matter, and it's like, that's not what not being racist means. So that's hard. I don't know. I don't have a solution. I only have complaints.
No, honestly, I think part of getting to a solution is identifying what's wrong and being really candid about it. I think people are now, for the first time, waking up. I think Anna mentioned this in the beginning. You know, yeah, 2020 has been the year where people have woken up and realized all of the injustices that exist. We've been talking about this forever. This has existed forever. And I think, you know, no one ever wants to see themselves as doing something that isn't, you know, it's inequitable or racist. But the reality is we're all contributing to this larger beast that is racism, unless we're proactively trying to dismantle it. And I think you made a really perfect point. You can wear your t-shirts, you can launch your marketing campaigns, but if you aren't paving the way for more people that look like us to be in the room, what are you doing? You're not doing anything to benefit our communities. And that's what needs to be called out. And I feel like sometimes that level of frank conversation is still not happening in the rooms.
I'm sorry, and I want to say like it needs to be called out by us. Like if you work at any of these companies, you have to tell your manager, like, hey manager, I'm very unhappy that our company has put out Black Lives Matter statements, but we have like no Black coworkers, things like that. Like if we don't call it out, the white people are never gonna do it for us.
I have so much to say.
Please, the floor is yours.
Oh my God, this is like, I've worked at Google, I worked at Uber, I'm at Grandma, and I'm in Silicon Valley. Like I have all sorts of different type of stories and like the goods and the bads of it. And yeah, like David is saying, don't give me the money and then go back and don't have a policy that helps us, that like discriminates against us. So it's very much about like, yeah, hire us, but make sure that you're going to keep us around, have some retention plan for us, have a career path that we can actually eventually get our manager, our director role, our vice president role. Like, how can we continue growing? It's not about just bringing me in and saying, cool, now we have a Latina engineer, that this is great. It's like, what are you going to do now that I'm here to actually keep me here? But then on all those, like, on all this like topics, it's just like, companies need to be held accountable. I led a class action lawsuit around gender and racial discrimination. We ended up settling public for $10 million. And in that settlement, it was very much of, don't give the named plaintiffs an NDA. Let us talk about what happened. What is it that we did in this entire lawsuit process to make it better? But then also allow for the lawsuit to have systematic change that keeps the company accountable on a legal notice of like, you're going to need to go check in on all your minority engineers. You're going to need to go check in and make sure that if they're not meeting the path, like the whatever you want to call it in your engineering organization, of like the level of engineering that they need to be, give them that feedback and then give them the resources for them to get to that level. We don't know what we're not doing right if nobody else gives us that feedback. So the company needs to do that. So it's very much about every single person that works anywhere. Go raise your concerns, hold your company accountable. They're tweeting out Black Lives Matters. Like, we stand against ICE or anything, it's like, okay, but show me the receipts. What are you actually doing? Like, are you actually all talk, or are you making policies that don't discriminate against us? And with that, it's just, it's like a giant trash fire. So like, it's very much like David is saying, it's like, I have a lot of thoughts, I have a lot of complaints, I can talk about like things that shouldn't get done, but a lot of it is like, leadership needs to understand that this is important. They need to give money to it. It's not just money. It's like, you need to give more than that. You actually need to care. How do we get you to care? Well, that's on you, and they need to go do their own learning. And I'm so tired of always hearing like founders be like, oh yeah, I have like 2 Latinos, I have 2 Black engineers, like they'll let me know once something goes wrong. No, we don't owe you anything. We don't need to be the ones to hold you accountable to be like, by the way, the algorithm you wrote 6 months ago when you started this company doesn't detect my face because I'm Latina and you're white. Like, why do we have to be the ones to put those complaints? So then it comes into every person in the organization, and I'm specifically looking at all the white people at the companies or people that hold a lot more privilege. Go use your voice, go use your leadership, go use your manager title and say, this is not okay. You don't have, like, those people don't need to wait for us to get angry. Go get angry yourselves, go educate yourselves. It's 2020, it's not the year for it to be only on minorities to fight for racial equality.
Anna for president. That's all I have to say. I agree.
I don't wanna. I just wanna add something very, very small, real quick, because I don't know why this is important, but it is very like interesting to me that I've spoken to people that work at Boeing, Microsoft, what's it called, Costco, Walmart Labs, like companies that most of us will, most people in tech think these companies are bullshit, and those people are so fucking happy there. Like, I met this guy, he's been at Boeing for like 25 years. Like building airplanes, and Boeing paid for his scholarship, for his master's degree, for his PhD. He's like, I will never leave this company. He's like, in 5 years, I'm gonna retire. I know like Intel has a program on with the Oakland School District where Intel like donates a lot of money, and like engineers from Intel go and meet with like Oakland. And obviously, there's a for profit motive, right? Like Intel knows that if they don't like train these new engineers, right, especially hardware engineers, because nobody's learning hardware anymore, they're not so like whatever, they have a but what I think is great, like super what's called impressive, or like I don't know what word to use that's good, but like what like confuses me a lot is that like, how are these companies that are like old school and old and dead and they don't innovate anymore much better at diversity than the younger companies that supposedly are more open to new ideas? And like, I know like companies like Comcast and NBC have more Latino executives than Google. So it's like, how, like what are you missing? What are you doing wrong? And why?
They cared about diversity earlier, which is one of those things like I continue pushing. It's like reliability, diversity needs to be a P0 in all the conversations. Put it on the backlog if you don't have enough engineering resources, but write it down and get to it. And it's very much too of like, those organizations have been around for such a long time that they know how to keep employees happy. There's a career path for them. All these companies coming up, somehow they think about that a year inside the organization when their team's already 20, 30 people. It's too late. You may have already lost that talent.
Absolutely. I think, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to mention, because I think in startup land, this meritocracy, this idea of meritocracy that I think most startup founders have is just the biggest myth and BS in the world. And it's perpetuated not within just the tech world, the startup world, but the VC world as well. And it's just this, I think people just have this, I don't know, ambiguous bar that they expect people of color to meet, to think of us as qualified in the same way that they see somebody that's white. And I think a lot of that is where all this comes from, is like founders that start companies that think like, oh, well, to be successful, I'm gonna find the people that are like me, or they kind of have this idea in their mind already that somebody that comes from something different background than them is less qualified by default. And it's taken a lot. I like to get myself into trouble all the time because I'm the person that always is like, hey, like, X person in tech, X accelerator, X whatever, like, oh, you don't have Black people on your board, or you don't have Latinos, or you like, or you're funding Latinos, but you're only funding, I think David was talking about this earlier, you're only funding Latinos that are already very affluent, that come from like other countries. You're not even funding Latinos from the US. Like, it's just like things like that I'm like, you're doing it because I know you're trying to check the box, but you're like completely missing the mark on it. And it all comes down to people just I think their own notion of self and worth being challenged by like there's somebody else that's actually qualified and face like 10 times the barriers to get here. Like, they see that as a bad thing instead of realizing the potential that somebody that faced 10 times the barriers, like the fact that they got to the same place that you did, just means they've got a lot more potential. It doesn't take anything away from you and your worth, but there's a lot of that I think happens with startups and tech and like the startup world specifically, where I think it makes founders uncomfortable at the end of the day. And, you know, it's like, I'm okay making people uncomfortable, but I know sometimes, you know, people do get upset when I call it out, but I'm just like, let me know, what is this ambiguous bar? Because you don't have a single Latina speaking at your event. And then I ask questions and then they're like, oh, well, because we don't know any Latinas that have raised more than $5 million. And then I was like, this is a real story. Then I came back and was like, here is a list of now I have almost 200 Latinas that I've put into a list of Latina founders. And I'm like, there's no excuse. Like, if you give me this ambiguous bar that you're saying that you don't have Latinos at your event because we haven't met this ambiguous bar, I can guarantee I can dispel that myth. But, you know, people are lazy and like they are uncomfortable when like we challenge them with actual data and results, and the fact that a lot of these notions and these things that they have, that things that they've made up in their own head as to why we don't belong, are actually not true or valid in any way.
That is so true.
I want to add another metric point to Cecilia's comments. I think it's this week or last week, it's 2020. A big financial tech company said that they don't have Black people in the organization because it's a pipeline problem. It's 2020. What do you mean? No, not acceptable. No.
Absolutely. And I think just to add to the final point here, one thing that I always feel like people tend to use as a scapegoat is if they do have a person of color on their team and it's just one, then they've checked the box. Because in more instances than not, they see that person as the exception. Oh, well, they were qualified enough, or they kind of fit the mold of what we're looking for, but we're not the poster children for all Latinos and Latinas who work in tech. We all think very differently, look very differently. And I think that that's the problem, where if you do happen to have people of color on your team, you can always have more. And it's not until you see that, and the problem is companies don't see that. And the more of that they're not unwilling to admit to and solve, we're going to keep running into the same issue. Because I agree with you, Anna. It's 2020. If you keep telling me that you have a pipeline problem, I literally can't with you. Like, I got to turn off the news. I got to walk away or have to call you out, because where are you looking? You're not looking in the right places.
Yeah.
Very much unfollowing, canceling culture. Like, yeah. No, like not cool.
But this is like super small things, like and you know, regarding to like your comment on like the bar, the arbitrarious bar, it's like it's also really bad because there's not that many Latino people that have done all these things, so it's always the same people on the same panels everywhere, and then we create these heroes, and then eventually these heroes fall because we all have fucking dark pasts. And then sometimes these heroes fall, and then people use this as an excuse to be like, oh, but you see that, that founder person did this bad thing before, and then it kind of like ruins all of us. And it's like I wish we were allowed to have more mediocre role models. Like, there's so many mediocre white people doing all sorts of stupid shit all the time, like fucking like that woman, I don't know, that like defrauded a lot of people of millions of dollars. Yeah, or the HP CEO that was a terrible CEO and made HP worse, and then she ran for president after that. And it's like, where are the Latino mediocre people? Like, why are we supposed to be perfect all the time? And oh, and then the other thing too is that, like, you know, sometimes when you like just look at a group of people and you think that that's enough for your product, that can be very bad. I think Twitter released a feature, or tried releasing a feature a few weeks ago, where they had voice notes instead of text tweets, and they were very proud because it was released by a group of Black engineers, and you know, kudos to them. But none of them looked at the what's it called, that you know, people that can read, can hear, are not going to be able to use this feature. So it's like, it's okay. Like, I mean, it's very laudable and it's super nice that you're giving opportunities to a group of, like, you know, diverse people, but like, you need to make sure that you're including the others too. Like, you need to make sure that, like, your ERG heads are all communicating with each other. You need to make sure that, like, you know, if you have a disability, like advocacy group, it's also communicating with your Black ERG and your Latino ERG, things like that. Because, you know, just because I'm Latino and because I'm undocumented, it doesn't mean that I'm not a woman, I'm not a Black person, I'm not Muslim. Like, there's a lot of things that I don't know how their experience is. So do not trust just me to like check off the box and be like, oh, I asked David, so this should be good. It's like, no, ask me and ask all the other people.
There you go. Again, I think it's important. We can't speak for any and all. We all have very different perspectives and live very different experiences. And that's the problem, where you have one person in the room, that's the start, but get more of us in the room, allow us to make the decisions. So yeah, I agree. I feel so amped up from this conversation. And I think, you know, on the last talking point, it'd be awesome for you guys to share any final pieces of advice or things that you have learned throughout your journey in tech that you'd recommend to anyone tuning in today.
I have a few. Like, it's all gonna be really scattered. Oh, hi Bunny. David's Bunny's on camera. It's so cute. So with everything, you're gonna get a lot of no's. People are gonna tell you can't do it, especially any minority group that you're in. It's gonna be, you don't have a space here, you don't belong here. Guess what? They're wrong. You belong here. You belong in tech. There's a space for you. You might be a little untraditional, it might be rough, but that's okay. Guess what? There's amazing communities like this conference, Techqueria, that are going to be there for you, to guide you, to give you more networking opportunities, tell you what companies you should really not go to. And along those lines, it's like, you have to take every single shot. All these doors are closed for you. You already know that you can't work at all these top 50 companies. Go ahead and apply to all the top 50 companies. You never know who's going to call you back and give you that interview. And the other one is very much on, this is just a job. We all know that we need the money. It's expensive to live. And in 2020, we've learned that it's even way harder. But hold your values, like to the core, what you got raised with, what you strongly believe in. You can leave a company at any moment. All these tech companies that say we're a family, no, you were just my paycheck. I have a life outside of here. You are not gonna do anything about my sexual harassment, like discrimination that I keep reporting to HR. Well, that's an issue. You're not gonna promote me. Well, that's an issue. I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna find a place that values me. Don't stay at this comfy job just because it's comfy. You have to not be scared. You have to lose your fear. And as a minority, it's hard. You get raised to be fearful. Like Latino parents, you can't go outside. You can't do this. You can't go to the party. Is the mom home? Like I got raised with all these questions. It was really hard to start being an adult and making my own decisions. But it was very much of like, no, I have full control my whole life, where I work, who I hang out with. I don't have to spend 40, 50 hours a week working for a company that doesn't respect me or makes policies that helps my career grow. But my biggest advice, find community. They're going to be there for you. I went through some rough patches with the lawsuit, my mental health, and the Latinos that were on Twitter, my Slack channels, Techqueria, Code 2040. Like, those folks know, like, everything was really rough. And that kept me here. I was about to leave technology because I was like, I'm so tired of being in this technology field for 10 years. A senior Latina engineer, nobody takes me seriously. People say my code sucks. And I am trying to tell this company that I need money because they have not paid minorities what they need to. And people are like, you're going to lose your tech career. No, I'm gonna find my community. They'll hold me together. We're gonna go find a new job, and guess what? I'll have my own company.
I wanted to build off of that and just mention how important it is for everybody to have the courage to speak up, because I think that's the only way we're going to continue to drive change, is to not be afraid to speak up. And sometimes, yeah, you put your own career at stake, or you put other things at stake, but I think at the end of the day, seeing it as like, you know, that meets a higher purpose than just you. And it's going to be critical, because it, unfortunately, I wish I said, like, you're a founder, it gets easier. It does not. I was on a panel very recently where somebody assumed that I was the assistant of the other speaker, even though I was the speaker, co-speaker with somebody else. And it's just like, all right, I get you invited me here and you still think I don't belong. Cool, good to know. But, you know, those things continue to happen where people assume I'm X, Y, or C thing. And it's not going to change, but I think the more we can speak up, the more we can educate others. And hopefully, you know, the next time that company invites a speaker, I did send an email to the CEO. Hopefully they're a little bit more aware, right? So there's like, don't invite us to check, again, we were talking about, you know, checking the box, like, don't invite a Latina speaker to check the box and then make them feel like they don't belong. So hopefully the next time that company invites somebody, you know, they don't do the same thing, but it's just important for all of us to use our voice and whatever privilege we have to just ensure that we're making things a little bit better for whoever comes after us.
Right?
I don't know.
We
I
want
don't
to
know.
leave the
Yeah,
group
no.
with?
Yes, of course. I just don't know what to say exactly. Like, right. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. I think it's very, very important to not have company loyalty. I think it's very important to speak up. I have been both. I worked at like very toxic companies, and I only realized it was very toxic until after I left. And you have to have a community. You need to have the people that you can ask, like you know, like a sounding board, or like because you can't rely on yourself for everything. As much as the US, you know, talks about like individuality and whatnot, like we like just talk to people. Join a even if you're like the fucking like biggest CEO of the world, you need a community. People have communities. Do not think that you can solve everything yourself. It is very, very hard to do everything yourself. And on the other hand too, like I remember like 7 years ago maybe, I went to an interview, and the what's it called, the person I was supposed to meet at first was a woman, so I didn't assume she was the CTO. So like even, you know, like even us make these mistakes. So it's like, I don't know, I guess I spent a lot of time thinking too, like how do we make change without chastising people, right? Because I feel like people on Twitter and online and whatever, they're very quick to be like, that guy's a fucking like asshole, super sexist. And it's like, I was like, well, maybe that person is learning. Like maybe we're all learning, right? Like I don't know. I had a journey, right? I wasn't born knowing all these things. I've been learning them over time. So it's like, how do we also like make I mean, obviously if somebody's a racist or racist, fuck them, but you know, if somebody's like, it's like having issues understanding what they feel, how do we make sure that we are less attacky and more supportive, and that I mean, I don't know, like we have this thing with Techqueria all the time, right? Like we have to moderate members. We have to, like, you know, there's people that come in stronger than others. There's also like all sorts of people. There's people that love Chavez, there's people that hate Chavez, there's people that have like tattoos of like Castro, and they're like, Castro is my life. And it's like, so it's like, and then there's other people that are like, I hate Castro, he stole my sugar farm. So it's like, you have to like always be moderating all these things. And it's like, you know, it's very important to remember that I don't know, you have to approach these questions with like kindness and understanding where possible, but also like if there's like a place that is very toxic or like evil or something, you have to cut it down. You like, sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it's very easy for us to think, especially I found this very common too with Latino women. They're like, oh no, this person or this company is very, very toxic and they're very evil, but if only I put more love into it, if only I try harder, they're going to accept me. And it's like, sometimes nobody's going to accept, like sometimes this place is not going to accept you. Sometimes you just need to quit, because if you stay there too long, it's just going to damage you a lot. And another thing that I wanted to say too, that I think is very, very important and very interesting about the tech community, is that the tech community, with all of the stupid bullshit problems that we are complaining about, it is still much better than many other industries by a lot. Like by a lot. Like I have what's called, I have treatment resistant depression, or whatever you want to call it. So I need to spend a lot of hours a week like under my bed hiding and thinking about my death and anguishing. And the tech industry is the only industry where I can like work remote and get away with that. If I was working for like, I don't know, a bank, I'll probably have to be in the office and pretend and hide my feelings, whatever. But like there's a lot of like benefits in working on the tech industry that are very great. So it's like all of these things that we're saying, hopefully, about the tech industry that we hate is because we love it and because we want to change it and make it better. If it wasn't salvageable, we wouldn't be complaining. So sorry, I just wanted to like make sure that the are motivated, because like it's like I don't want you all to feel like super gloomy. It's like, no, it sucks a little, but it sucks in a way that we can fix it.
Yeah. The reason we're here, the reason we're having this conversations is to invite you to join us so that there's more of you in this space and that we make it better for the next generation. It's just that we thank everyone for the work that they've done prior to us, but we know there's a long road ahead. And for that, we need more of you to be part of this.
Absolutely. So I think that is, there's nothing left to be said. I think that you guys provided incredible insight. I really enjoyed today's conversation. Tell the folks where to find you. Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. What's your preferred choice?
Twitter.
What's your handle?
It's just my name, Cecilia Corral.
Awesome.
That's a good thing about being Latino.
I know.
I find all the handles everywhere.
You can find me on any social media, Ana Margarita Medina, on Twitter and Instagram. That's going to be Ana_M_Medina. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I have a contact form on my website. You can get a hold of me.
Awesome. David?
If you look at yourself in the mirror and think about me for 5 minutes, I'll show up in your room or something. Sorry.
All right.
No,
I'm gonna try that real quick.
No, I'm David Silva on most social media, but the best way to talk to me is to join the Techqueria Slack and find me there. You know, like I'm very active. I don't look at my other social medias enough, but yeah, no, join our community, join the Latinas in Tech community, join any of these amazing communities that are part of this event, and we'll be there. We're very fine.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And for anyone tuning in, good luck. Keep working. You know, there's no linear path to breaking into tech. And, you know, if you learned anything today, it's everyone's journey is different and will look very different. But there's a lot of opportunity. We need more people like you in the room. So thank you guys again. And I look forward to hearing, you know, future conversations about the topic we talked about today. So bye, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.